Hello and welcome to State of the Economy. Today we have with us Biraj Patnaik, who is Principal Advisor to the Commissioners appointed by the Supreme Court to monitor the Right to Food program. The Right to Food program has been on for many years following the Supreme Court's intervention, and in some ways it is the spirit of this program, this Right to Food initiative from the Supreme Court that resulted in the food security legislation which the UPA brought last year. And today we are discussing with Biraj where the entire campaign or where the entire legislation and its implementation is headed, because there are worries that that implementation of the Food Security Act is not happening in the spirit in which the law was brought, and many states are yet to really implement it, and there is a fear that the central government may even roll back some of the provisions of the Food Security Act. So to discuss all that, we have with us Biraj. Welcome to our show, Biraj Patnaik. So I recently read your article in the Hindu, and you also express the apprehension that that in spirit this Food for All program is not really sort of being carried forward at the pace that was originally envisaged or desired, or even desired by the legislation.
Yeah. I mean, let me begin by saying, to put it mildly, we have a government now that is not very enthusiastic about rights, let alone about the right to food. But what is more worrying is that, you know, if you look at the totality of it all, what we are witnessing now is a change in the welfare architecture in India. And what I highlighted in my piece was really one bit of what's happening across the social sector. Now, as you very rightly pointed out, the National Food Security Act, with whatever its flaws or shortcomings at that time may have been, was one real hope.
It still has some shortcomings.
Absolutely, it may have many shortcomings, but be that as it may, it was seen as a bulwark against the fight on hunger. You know, that this was so central to the fight against hunger that it was seen as something very critical. There was very broad political consensus. The BJP insisted on the floor of Parliament. Their stalwarts like Sushma Swaraj, Arun Jaitley, all of them said that, you know, this is a weak act. We need to make it even more progressive when it was being legislated.
That's what your article mentions, that how Sushma Swaraj, even Rajnath Singh, Modi also wrote
to the Prime Minister.
To the Prime Minister, saying that he wants to actually expand it further.
Expand the ambit of the act.
And I remember Rajnath Singh once said that the Chhattisgarh model, covering nearly 90% of the people, goes way beyond the coverage that the Food Security Act envisages. So they're going to implement that Chhattisgarh model everywhere.
This was something, as far as the BJP was concerned, their states, or the states that they were in power, were doing much better on the public distribution system, be it Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, even Rajasthan to some extent.
And all this they said in Parliament.
And they said this in Parliament. And they said, look, you know, we have ownership over this act and we would want to support the government, but, you know, provisions are too weak. Let's do it.
Then what's happened?
Well, as Mr. Shanta Kumar, the former food minister who headed a committee which wrote a report saying that the act should be wound down and reduced to 40%, said...
Coverage of 40% of population.
Yeah, from 67%, which is 75% of rural and 50% urban. When he was asked by journalists that, you know, this is an act that was supported by you, why are you asking the coverage to be reduced from 67% to 40%? He said, well, you know, we did it at the heat of the elections. So, obviously, it seems now to me that the government is not only not committed to taking the act, following the act in spirit, but they may bring in many measures which I have been apprehensive about in this. But, as you rightly pointed out, since 2001, the Supreme Court has been closely monitoring all the food schemes, and much of what is there enshrined in the Act are part of the Supreme Court orders. So it was the Supreme Court which universalized the midday meal scheme when Mr. Vajpayee was in power, and government said they didn't have the revenue. Court said, forget it, we want it universalized, we don't want any child going to any primary school going hungry. So they had to introduce a 2% cess on petrol, education cess, if you recall, was introduced, which was used to fund Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan and the midday meal program, and so on and so forth. The ICDS
that still continues, right?
All those orders, despite the act being in place, continue. The new PDS control order, it's violative in 3 ways. But the bigger violation, I think, is that the government extended the implementation of the act. Now, the act says that it has to be within a year. And a year meaning when the ordinance was first passed.
The year is over, right?
It's been 2 years. Now, what has happened is, if you had to extend the implementation of the act, because it is mentioned in the act, you should have gone to Parliament and introduced an amendment to the act to extend it. Instead, they did it by executive orders, not once but thrice. Whatever be the reason that states are not prepared, and we can talk about that later.
They're also talking about the socio-economic and caste survey not having got completed.
Well, who's responsible? Because this socio-economic caste survey is 6 years late, number one. Number two, it is not mandatory on the states to use the socio-economic caste survey. They can use any method. So, the implementation should have begun, and you know, if there was a change, they should have gone.
Are you saying all states most of the states are violating the deadline?
Well, the act does not require a phasing out of that program. Programs like I have mentioned the Antodaya Anna Yojana. Now, this is a program that affects the poorest of the poor, for widows, for disabled, for people without support.
Will that run parallel to the Food Security?
It is part of the Food Security Act.
So it gets merged into the Food Security?
It was always part of the National Food Security Act. And this gave a higher entitlement. So the National Food Security Act has an entitlement of 7 kilos, 5 kilos per month per person. 5 kilos per month per person. Whereas Antodaya was a blanket 35 kilos. So if you were a 4-member family, you'd still get 35 kilos at the same subsidized rate. And if you were a larger family, you'll still get 35 kilos. Now, what the ministry is proposing is to phase out Antodaya. And I'd like to remind the viewers
but if they phase out Antodaya, the household still gets, a 5-member household, they'll get 25 kilos of food grains, right?
They will get 25 kilos of food grains subject to the limit of the
extra 10 kilos
they lose the extra 10 kilos. And that matters because now it's not just a question of losing 10 kilos. First, we must remember that of all the programs that the government, the PDS, which has been criticized for its non-functioning, this was one component of the PDS because India still has some social capital and some sense of embarrassment even in a village where no one wants to steal from the poorest of the poor. So by default, the Antodaya Anna Yojana was the best performing of all the programs of the PDS. So now, even if there is a leakage in the priority categories where you get 5 kilos, people who were drawing Antodaya grains, there was no leakage or very little leakage. That advantage will be lost. And lastly, I don't understand what this government is doing because Antodaya Anna Yojana program was started by the Vajpayee government. It was something that he was personally very attached to and expanded it while he was
I believe this government also committed itself to Antodaya when they came to power.
Absolutely. This is a
there
recurring
are public
phrase.
Statements there, right?
There are public phrase there because the phrase Antodaya itself is associated with Deen Dayal Upadhyay and other worthies of the political right in India. And even with the RSS, there is that they come with this notion, I mean, not rights but charity. They are much more into the charity mode than say, much in the same way that the communists are in the rights mode. So it's surprising that the ministry has chosen to attack a program which in a broader way, even though it may not be part of the rights discourse, fits in very well with the political agenda of the right.
But tell me, you just said 11 states are implementing it in some form or the other. The other 29 minus 11, the other states are being run by various parties. So why aren't they doing it? I mean, there would be Congress, there would be, I guess, other regional parties, BJP also. But what's happening there?
Okay. So what's happening is, one is that in some states which are up for elections this year, they don't want to tinker with the identification list. So they don't want to bring out a new criteria.
So Bihar would want to.
So they would want to hold on till such time that they can without fully.
So that's why Bihar must have delayed the implementation.
Bihar, and I would say to some extent
West
UP, Bengal. So wherever there are local factors,
next year, no?
Absolutely. So wherever there are local factors, that's one part. Second is that some political parties simply don't have the will, or the state leadership there does not have the will to implement an act like this in its entirety. So they would hold on, and Government of India has extended it and given them an excuse to do so. So they would hold on to the extent possible.
Why should these states be feel insecure politically because the coverage is so wide, 67%, they'll actually end up increasing the coverage from present level, right?
Yes.
Whether it's Bihar, UP.
Absolutely.
Are you saying that they're worried because that some of the better off under the criteria, socio-economic caste criteria, may have to give up the entitlement?
Absolutely. Because if they have to draw up a new list,
they fear that there will be resentment from those who will lose the entitlement.
Yeah. Either way, even if there's no resentment, a new process of identification is never ideal in a pre-election phase. So that is understandable. But I think it's a lost opportunity for them.
A well-off Dalit household,
yes, absolutely,
may have to give up.
Yeah.
So that might create some political
yes,
problems.
absolutely. And you know, I think it's a lost opportunity. If I look at a state like UP, their coverage, if I was the head of the government there, I would just universalize it and give it to everybody.
Given that there is 65% poverty ratio there, right?
Absolutely. And for rural areas, therefore, already 80% plus would be there. Jharkhand, 90% plus. So Bihar, again, 80% plus in rural areas. So I would just give the money from the state exchequer for the additional 20% and implement it.
Yeah. We'll take a small break here and come back to the discussion. Please don't go and keep watching RSTV. Welcome back to State of the Economy. We are having a conversation with Biraj Patnaik, who is principal advisor to the commissioners appointed by the Supreme Court to monitor the right to food program in the country. So, Biraj, you were talking about how the Shanta Kumar Committee report is also attempting to scale down the coverage of people who should get subsidized food grains under the food security program. So 67% is what the legislation, food security legislation talks about. He wants to bring it down to 40%. Now, one of the arguments Shanta Kumar makes is that there's a lot of leakage. Now, have you studied this leakage aspect? Have you quantified? Because there is a feeling that a lot of food stocks, they get siphoned off to small industries, for food processing units who may even be supplying to multinationals, you know. So, I mean, what's your sense? Yeah.
So, yes, there is a problem of leak. I mean, first I want to say, but before I go there, that this was not the mandate of the Shanta Kumar Committee. They exceeded their mandate by making
their mandate was to study the reforms in the food distribution.
In the Food Corporation of India.
For Food Corporation.
And, you know, look at the FCI and what needs to be done. It was about restructuring of the FCI. So obviously...
So he backward integrated that.
Completely. You know, went into an area where angels would fear to tread by offering a number of 40%, because, I mean, one can ask why 40%? Why not 42 or why not 44? So that was not his mandate, but he did that. On the point of leakage, yes, there are leakages. There's no denying that. But if you look at the last 10 years, we have seen the leakages reduce substantially. Now, Government of India's own statistics would suggest that about a third of the food grains in many parts of the country are being siphoned off. But unfortunately, the number is not very clear, because in their calculations, they even, you know, they look at grain which state governments are giving. For instance, when the Planning Commission's report came out many years ago, suppose Tamil Nadu was giving additional grains out of the state exchequer. Government of India considered that as a leakage. I mean, the people who wrote that report in the Planning Commission. So therefore, possibly a third of the grains are going out. What we do know, that in 8 or 10 states in the last 7 years, reforms have transformed the PDS. Chhattisgarh, for instance, unfortunately mired now in a scam, but in Chhattisgarh, for instance, leakages were down to less than 10%. The same in Orissa, the same in Andhra Pradesh, the same in
I believe Bihar has also done very well on reducing leakage.
Considerably improved, considerably improved. So there is a trend. The trend is of reducing corruption in an area, in an era, and in an area which was riddled with corruption earlier. Now, if I extend this argument, corruption in defense deals has not gone down. Should we stop procurement for defense? Or should we shut down the industries where corruption is established? Should we stop all mining? Should we stop using cell phones because the spectrum sale was controversial in the last government? So I don't think shutting down a scheme is a solution.
So what do you suggest to reduce corruption? Do you think people at a certain level, well, maybe the bottom 30-40% may be entitled to Antodaya type of schemes, but above that, some sort of cash transfer is it viable, which reduces leakage?
No, let me answer the first part of your question first. What should we do to reduce corruption? The National Food Security Act has a roadmap of reforms. There are 10 points, which includes computerization, which includes deprivatizing the PDS system to give it over from private traders to self-help groups and women's groups. It includes putting information online, making it more transparent, accountable. So first, if you are serious about reducing corruption, then please implement what is there in the National Food Security Act.
Okay.
Number one. Number two, the experience of the states that I spoke about. What is it that they did, which was a single point sort of attack on corruption, something that really eliminated a large part? They expanded the PDS. Now, it may sound counterintuitive that how can the expansion of a scheme reduce corruption? That happened because you added more stakeholders in the village. So it became far more difficult for the PDS trader, who was earlier dealing with the poorest of the poor, to now deny benefits to people, because the other castes, the dominant castes, the poor from other castes, were also part of the same PDS queue. So the pressure increased, accountability increased. On cash transfers, look, many countries have successfully tried it out. But in India, unfortunately, due to a variety of reasons, cash transfers are unlikely to work, as they have not worked in many schemes. And the reason is we don't have the banking infrastructure.
You don't have the banking.
We don't have the IT infrastructure that can enable this.
But once you have these banking and IT infrastructure...
well, even then, because you see, what is the architecture
Actually,
of
why I'm saying this?
Yeah.
Because you look at the economics, the government procures it from the farmer, and he, say at 18 rupees or for grains, 20 rupees,
Yes.
and it gives it back to the poor
consumer.
farmer, among consumers, there are consumer farmers, at 2 to 3 rupees.
Yes.
And in this period, there's so much cost being incurred by the government. It is procuring, it is storing, and then it's sending back to them,
Absolutely.
So why procure at all? At least for some farmers who are more, whose farming is more like self-consumption oriented. Suppose you give them cash and let them hold the grains, So,
Well, that's already happening. I mean, first we must understand that the public distribution system has two pillars. It is also a mechanism, it's the only mechanism that government has, the minimum support price, to stabilize prices during harvest time for farmers.
Yeah, sure.
So it's an income support to farmers.
Yeah.
Now, what happens? And I'm a farmer, if the procurement works well, I'm a farmer, suppose I had a consumption need of say 30 kilos and I had a marketable surplus of 30 kilos, I would only sell the marketable surplus. Now, what happened in states like Chhattisgarh? When the government put in place a very good procurement system, the farmer wouldn't hold on to his or her crop. She would sell all 60 kilos to the government and buy it back at a lower rate. So, effectively, a good functioning PDS as well as a functional procurement system is an effective cash transfer in itself to the farmer.
Okay.
So, now you would say that, okay, then why not give cash? Now, the reason is that if you eliminated this support, governments would have to compensate farmers as well.
Okay.
So, the argument that this is creating a market distortion doesn't hold, number one. Number two, when food comes into the household, it's controlled by women. Please remember that. When cash comes into the household, it will be controlled by men.
That argument is...
Number three,
made very
there is no barrier against inflation. We have no mechanism to inflation index what the money that you will give. And number five, our experience that, say, pensions, old age pensions, for instance, or disability pensions, or widow pensions, they are as inefficient and corruption-ridden as the in-kind transfers. So, if cash transfers were a magic wand, then surely we should have had far less corruption in those schemes. And if you go to ask a politician today in his constituency, which is the program which is not doing well, is it the PDS or is it the pensions? And they would say, no, pensions, because a large number of people don't get their pensions on time.
Tell me, how do you solve the problem of these massive food stocks with the FCI and their inability to actually offload, distribute it to the poor at the right time? I mean, this has been a problem forever. I mean, in our country, there are very simple things which don't seem to happen. So, what is your experience in your work on at the grassroots?
I think that the National Food Security Act would have done just that. Because by expanding coverage, you were ensuring, because, we are holding 3 times as much stock as we need to hold at any given point in the last 3 years.
No, as we are sitting, as we are talking, shouldn't a lot of that be offloaded to the very poor?
Absolutely, and that was the spirit of the National Food Security Act. The place for food grains is not in the godown; it's in the bellies of the starving children. And if you do not implement it, you're going to have that problem.
Do you think that in that context, coming back to Shanta Kumar, there's a case for decentralizing this food holding or food stocking mechanism? Like I remember there was a public policy idea, suggestion that instead of centralized storing, why not decentralize the storing and say let the panchayats administer them? So is that viable?
No, you're absolutely right, Venu. It is not only viable, but I think now 14 states have demonstrated that not only is it possible, but it is desirable that when you have a decentralized procurement system, a Government of India scheme on decentralized procurement, it enables the state governments, first there's more political ownership because it's they who are doing it. Second, it allows for the creation of infrastructure. Third, for storage. Third, it reduces wastage. Fourth, it brings about efficiency because you're not transporting food from one part of the country to the other, but doing it at a much more local level.
So some sort of, that if you're procuring from a spot, the storage should not be beyond 100 kilometers of that, 150, 200 kilometers.
Well, absolutely. To some, you can set a norm, but certainly decentralized procurement. And believe it or not,
and also
all of this is part of the National Food
more
Security
items
Act.
Of procurement.
Absolutely.
Currently, there is this big sham that happens every year when the government announces 22 items for procurement, and whereas they do only 3 or 4 food grains and maybe 1 or 2. But jowar, bajra, many other items which are nutritious, which are needed for the human body.
But Venu, that is the point. All of this is part of the National Food Security Act.
Soya,
we have said, and millets have been incentivized by with a lower price at 1 rupee per kilo. So if people want to consume nutritious millets, there is an incentive for them to do that. That is part of the Act. Doorstep delivery and strengthening of decentralized systems is part of the Act. So therefore, it's really distressful, to say the least, to see this act being destroyed when it's founded on common sense.
So the government is not looking at these possibilities, and it's merely focused on this narrow objective of reducing fiscal deficit or maybe saving some 20,000-30,000 crore.
Well, not even 20,000 crores. I mean, the Antodaya, for instance, what is the kind of savings you expect? It will not even reach 100 crores.
No, I believe the total Food Security Act bill works out to about 1 lakh.
Well, about 100,000 crores.
Little over 100,000.
A little over 100,000 crores. We are already spending that amount. Now, what is happening? Now, that's one level. You're also making it difficult for people to access grains by putting in a clause that they have to establish citizenship or residency in a state, which was not there earlier. So why do you want to bring in these clauses? Now, if you're a Bengali-speaking Muslim in Delhi as a migrant, you are not going to get a ration card because as it is, they face innumerable hurdles because of suspected citizenship.
So what's your...
and it's going to hurt the thing.
So where do you think, quickly, if you can, 30 seconds, where are we headed in terms of implementation? When do you think the remaining states, the whatever, 15 remaining states, 16, 17 states will implement this? In what form? I mean, what's your sense?
No, I would think that there are significant challenges because there have been huge budget cuts. The ICDS budget, which is part of the Act, has been reduced by half. The midday meal budget has been reduced by a third.
These are all centrally sponsored schemes which have been slashed.
Which have been slashed very badly.
And there's no alternative plan.
And there is no alternative plan. So that is going to be the single biggest hurdle in achieving full implementation of the NFSA. They have to find the money now, which is guaranteed under the Act. We have already filed a petition in the Supreme Court bringing to the notice of the court all of these irregularities that have happened and the impediments in the functioning of the Act. And it is a pity that after Parliament has legislated an Act, so soon we are going back to the courts and pushing ourselves by 15 years.
So you feel that the Supreme Court can intervene in the matter of these huge reduction in centrally sponsored schemes, especially in regard to food supply to the poor?
Absolutely, because these are not merely schemes now. They are legal entitlements. They are a right. And the courts have the...
And they're covered by the Food Security
completely.
Act.
So therefore, but it's as I said, the right to food was a matter of politics. It should have been resolved by politics. It's a tragedy that it will now perhaps be resolved by the courts. It's not a fiscal matter. It's not a fiscal matter.
Thank you very much, Biraj Patnaik, for talking to us. That's all we have in this edition of State of the Economy. We'll be back with you next week. Thanks for watching.